Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning on human rights in the workplace. What are human rights? If you're not yet familiar with this webinar series, this is actually the first in 3. So we're doing this one today on what are human rights. In October, we have one on termination of employment. And then in November, we have one on resolving disputes. So just a quick little intro to this series. So we're going to get started. I know some people are probably still trickling in, but we're going to do some introductions first, and then we'll jump into the content. It's going to change. There we go. Okay, so my name is Jessica Steingard. I am one of the staff lawyers here at the Centre for Public Legal Education Alberta, or Sipley for short. And Sipley is a nonprofit organization that's role is to make the law understandable for Albertans. So we produce a variety of resources that are freely available to the public that just explain the law in a way that's easier to understand. So we have booklets, webinars, websites, FAQs, videos, etc., all about the law. But you also will see 2 other faces at the top of your screen. So we also have Carolyn Cron, who is the interim executive director at the Workers Resource Center. And we have Quinn, who is the sexual harassment legal specialist, also at the Workers Resource Center, or WRC. And they'll share a little bit about themselves later on, but the Workers Resource Center is an organization that supports Alberta workers with a variety of employment-related issues. And they'll talk about some of their services later on in the presentation. So welcome, Carolyn and Quinn as well. You'll also see 2, you might see 2 Sipley. At the top of your screen, we have Natalie Tremblay, our education and design specialist. She's working behind the scenes to make sure that our webinar this morning goes smooth. So thank you, Natalie, for keeping us on track. Quick disclaimer. So this presentation this morning contains legal information only, and it is not intended to be legal advice. We also want to acknowledge funding provided by the Department of Justice Canada. Both Sipley and the WRC receive funding from the Department of Justice, and we are so grateful for that funding so that we can do things like this here today. I have a couple other housekeeping items. You will notice that we are recording today's session, and that is because we will be making this also available on demand. So give us about a week or 2, and that will be posted for you to be able to watch later on at your convenience. And if you have to leave today's session early, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation form when you leave. So if you can take 30 seconds and fill that out, we just want to make sure that webinars like this are, that you're finding them useful or anything we can improve on. So thank you for that. Okay, we're going to start with a quick poll. So we're talking about human rights in the workplace today. Natalie's going to pop a poll up on your screen. We just want to get a sense of how familiar everyone is right now with human rights in the workplace. So if you can choose the answer that corresponds to where you're at. Perfect. Okay, so it looks like we have a mixed crowd here this morning, which is awesome. Hopefully there'll be something for everyone. One thing I did forget to mention as well is we will be leaving time at the end for questions. So we would ask that you ask your questions in the Q&A function on your screen only, and then we'll get to those at the end of the session. But you can throw them in when you think of them, but we'll address them at the end. Okay, let's dive in this morning then. So quick overview of what we want to share today. So we're going to start with a discussion on human rights in Alberta, what they are, what the legal test is, what the legislation is, who and when they apply, etc. We also want to take an opportunity to spotlight sexual harassment at work. There's a lot of work right now going on across the country, a lot of different projects that are focused on sexual harassment in the workplace. And so we want to do a bit of a spotlight on that topic. And then we're going to share some resources with you, where to get help and different options available. So without further ado, let's dive in then. So what are human rights? Human rights generally are rights we have simply for existing as humans. So the Canadian Human Rights Commission says, you do not have to earn your human rights, you are born with them. They are the same for every person. Nobody can give them to you, but they can be taken away. So human rights are recognized in a variety of ways. So at the international level, international law level, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this lists 30 fundamental rights that everyone in the world has. Then each country can then choose to enshrine those laws or those rights into their own domestic laws. So in Canada, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which you've probably heard of. And then we also have national, provincial, and territorial human rights legislation that further enshrine some of those laws in Canadian law. So what are some of these human rights that we're speaking of? Well, one example is the right to life, liberty, and security of person. So you may have heard that one before. Another right is no one shall be a slave, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. The right to be recognized as a person before the law, recognizing that everyone's equal before the law, right to marry and own property, and the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So that's just a smattering of some of the human rights that exist. But of course, we're talking today about human rights in the workplace. And surprise, surprise, employees do have human rights at work. So what exactly are these rights? Well, again, going back to that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about the right to be able to work, the free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work. And then it also talks about having the right to work without discrimination and the right to equal pay for work. So these are on the international level. But what are we talking about here in Canada? What do our Canadian Alberta laws say about these human rights at work? Well, in Canada and Alberta, we have two laws that apply. So overarching is the Canadian Human Rights Act that applies all across Canada. And when we're looking at Alberta, we also have the Alberta Human Rights Act. So we have two different pieces of legislation. Now, they actually both do apply in Alberta, just not at the same time. So we're going to talk about when one applies versus the other to Alberta workers. I do want to note that these laws cover more than just workplace human rights. So they also cover housing, goods and services, etc. But we're going to be looking specifically at what they say about human rights at work. So if you've heard of human rights, you've the gist of it is that you have the right to be free of discrimination based on race, religious beliefs, color, gender or sex, gender identity, gender expression, physical disability, mental disability, age, ancestry, place of origin, marital status, source of income, family status, sexual orientation, gender characteristics, and also to be free from discrimination based on conviction for an offense that has been pardoned or where a record suspension has been ordered. Now, these are called, or what we call protected grounds or protected characteristics. So these are found in both the Alberta Human Rights Act and the Canadian Human Rights Act. I do want to note, though, that the two at the bottom with the asterisks there, those are only in the Canadian Human Rights Act. So the Alberta Human Rights Act does not recognize gender characteristics or conviction for offenses. But these are, like I said, they're called protected grounds or protected characteristics. So we've thrown out this word discrimination. When we're talking about discrimination, there's actually a legal test or three elements that need to be shown to prove the discrimination has happened. And again, this is discrimination generally, but we're going to apply it specifically in the workplace. So the first thing to show that discrimination has happened is that there is the protected characteristic exists. So that was that list we just talked about. So the person who's saying that they have been discriminated against must show that they have a protected characteristic. The second thing they must show is a negative effect. I'm going to go through what possible negative effects are in the workplace, but just hold on to that second one there. And then the third part of this test is that the person must show that the protected characteristic was a factor of the negative effect. So let's break this down. Let's first look at negative effects, and then I'm going to break it down using an example, and hopefully that will make this test a little bit clearer. So when we're talking about negative effects, we sometimes also refer to them as adverse impacts. So negative effects that could happen are not getting a job, the terms and conditions of someone's employment being negatively changed. So, for example, that could be reduced pay. That could mean not being promoted at work. That could mean being forced to work in unsafe or toxic work conditions. We might also be talking about being denied access to benefits or being denied a leave or accommodation. So perhaps any kind of leaves that might be mentioned under employment standards legislation. When we talk about accommodation, we'll be talking about the duty to accommodate. I believe that's in the next webinar series. Someone also may be forced to quit because of the discrimination. Or a big one is being terminated for making a complaint. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this last one here, being terminated for making a complaint. So human rights legislation is very clear that retaliation is not okay. So if someone makes a complaint that they have been discriminated against, say they make their complaint to their employer, and then their employer decides, we don't really want this person around, seems like they're causing some kind of trouble, we're going to get rid of them because they've made this complaint. That is not okay. So the Alberta Human Rights Act says that no person shall retaliate against another person because they've made a complaint or attempted to make a complaint, because they've given evidence or participated in a human rights proceeding under the Human Rights Act. So any type of retaliation is not okay under the Alberta Human Rights Act. So I just want to focus on that one for a minute. Okay, so now that we understand what the negative effects are, we've looked at that list of protected grounds. How do we put this all together back in that test? So let's use an example. Let's say someone's pregnant, so they can no longer lift heavy boxes. Their boss refuses to modify their work and instead terminates their employment. So first, we have a protected characteristic because pregnancy falls under the protected characteristic of gender or sex. So that's protected under human rights legislation. The boss not accommodating their condition and instead terminating their employment is a negative effect. So we've got our negative effect there. And the reason for that negative effect was the pregnancy, which was the protected characteristic. So there's our third element of the test. So hopefully that kind of shows you how those three elements work together and what that legal test for discrimination looks like. There's a few other pieces to discrimination that we want to elaborate on today. So another one being, who exactly do these laws apply to? Who is protected by human rights legislation? Well, the first one might seem obvious, which was employees. So we generally think of employee as someone who has an employment relationship with an employer. They're probably paid, they work a certain number of hours, there's probably source deductions, etc. The boss probably controls their schedule and whatnot. But interestingly enough, employee is not defined in human rights legislation. And there's a reason for that. Instead, we want to broadly consider who is protected, because if we don't, then this would allow some organizations to escape liability under the legislation if it only applied to employees in the typical employee-employer relationship. So instead, we see a much more broad interpretation of the concept of an employee. So case law, so judge-made law or judges' decisions coming out of the courts across Canada, as well as the different human rights commissions across the country, have recognized all sorts of workers as being protected by human rights legislation. So some examples are independent contractors. So this might be a case where an independent contractor works for one person only. So maybe they work as a contractor, but that their boss, controls their hours, controls their pay, etc. So while there may not be, the employee relationship in terms of, benefits provided or source deductions, the employer or the person that they're working for may still control a lot of that employment or their work aspects. So in some cases, independent contractors have been found to be protected by human rights legislation. In other cases, we also see subcontractors being protected. taxi drivers, Army cadets, and volunteers. Now, I'm going to mention this doesn't mean that all taxi drivers, all independent contractors, all Army cadets are protected, but there's been examples where these types of positions have been protected. And what we're looking for is basically the relationship between the person controlling the worker and the worker's role. So there's a quote out of a case from the BC Human Rights Tribunal that basically looks at who is receiving the benefit of the employee services. Are they controlling the terms and conditions of employment and the workplace environment? Do they bear the burden of paying the person? It's these types of entities that are also able to remedy any effects of discrimination in the workplace. And so that's really what we're looking at, is that the relationship between the worker and the organization. Now, I made a comment at the beginning that we have two pieces of legislation in Alberta that apply. We have the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Alberta Human Rights Act. So another part of this who puzzle is which law applies to those workers. So the Alberta law applies to most workers, except for those that are regulated by the Canadian Human Rights Act. And the workers regulated by the Canadian Human Rights Act are what we call federally regulated workers. So these are workers that are also protected by federal employment standards, occupational health and safety rules, etc. So who are these workers? Anyone who works for the federal government. It's also anyone who works in railways and shipping, telephone and cable systems, radio and TV broadcasting, transporting, including road and air, banking, and First Nations administrations. And for those of you familiar with jurisdictions in Canada and how the laws work, this distinction goes back to our Constitution and which level of government has responsibility for which types of industries. And so these different industries fall under federal jurisdiction, which is why these types of workers are regulated by federal laws and not the provincial laws where the workers reside or work. So little carve out there for the Canadian Human Rights Act. Another question we can ask is, when do human rights in the workplace apply? Well, it actually applies to basically most aspects of the relationship. So it starts right at recruiting. So how is, the ad being put out there? What's the job posting look like? The hiring process. So, we've all heard of the questions that an interviewer can and cannot ask during the interview. How old are you? Are you planning to have children? Those types of things. That would fall into the hiring process. The terms and conditions. So this, again, talking about pay, hours of work, benefits. So who has access to benefits? What are the workplace policies? They could be discriminatory against some or all workers. And we're also looking at the end of employment. So the termination, which again, we're going to spend an entire webinar in October looking at termination of employment and human rights but that's the last part of the process there of the human right of the employment relationship. So hopefully that's a quick, gives you a good overview of what human rights in the workplace look like, who they apply to, when they apply. And as I said at the beginning, we're also going to focus on sexual harassment. And as I said, the reason we're doing this is there's a lot of work going on right now across the country, and it's been funded by the Department of Justice Canada. A lot of work right now to educate, prevent, and address sexual harassment in the workplace. The bottom line is sexual harassment is not okay. And why are we talking about this? So why is it such a big topic of discussion? Well, Statistics Canada collected data from February 4th, 2020 to June 30th, 2020. So about 5 months they collected information. And what they found was that 25% of women and 17% of men had experienced sexual misconduct in their workplace in the previous year. So those are pretty high numbers. So that's 1 in 4 women and almost 1 in 5 men that's experiencing sexual misconduct in their workplace. So now hopefully that gives you some context as to why sexual harassment is the topic that we're kind of spotlighting today. This report is available online. It was done, like I said, it's a 2020 report. We'll give you a link to that at the end. So what is sexual harassment? It's any unwanted or unwelcome behavior that is sexual in nature and negatively affects you. So it is actually a type of discrimination based on the protected grounds of gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. So sexual harassment is discrimination. What are some examples of sexual harassment? Examples include inappropriate looks or touches, comments or teasing that are sexual in nature. So it could be jokes or, some comments about clothing or whatnot. Oh, that skirt's really short, or that top's really low cut. It could be unwanted physical contact or closeness. So brushing up against someone, touching their back or the shoulder when they don't want to be touched. It could be unwanted sexual requests or demands. So it could be pretty blatant. Could be jokes about gender or sexual orientation. So it might not be directed at someone, but it could be jokes about gender or sexual orientation in general. It could be talk about sexual activities. And it could be suggestive photos or drawings. So that email chain that works its way around the office that's got, the horrible joke or drawing in it that's really not appropriate. These are all examples of sexual harassment. And as you can see in this list, sexual harassment ranges in severity. So it can be quite severe and include touching or contact, which actually may also lead to the criminal realm of things. So we may be moving out of, strictly human rights and moving also into criminal offenses when we get to, talking about assault or whatnot. I also want to make it clear that the person causing harassment at work could be a variety of people. So it might be your boss. It could be also be a customer or a coworker. Perhaps you're a teacher or instructor, and it could be a student, it could be a client, or it could be a contractor. So while we often see sexual harassment being linked to positions of power, it doesn't necessarily have to be. It really can be anyone. Okay, rather than just keep talking at you, I want to take a minute and do a couple exercises here. We're going to go through 3 different examples and look at whether or not we think discrimination has taken place here. And these 3 examples we're actually going to use throughout the next 2 webinars as well to kind of demonstrate some of these concepts of discrimination, resolving disputes, how the employment relationship ends, etc. So let's meet 3 examples. And I will note these are not real people. These are made up examples for the point of illustrating these concepts. So let's look at Alex. So Alex works in construction. Their coworker repeatedly asks them out on a date. Alex always says no. But the coworker is getting more and more persistent. Alex's other coworkers and boss just laugh at the situation. They don't do anything about it. Alex no longer feels comfortable at work because they're constantly facing this person asking them out. And so Alex eventually quits their job. Another poll is going to pop up on your screen. It's going to ask you 3 questions. Is there a protected characteristic here? Is there a negative effect? And is the protected characteristic a factor in the negative effect? So these are just yes, no questions. But if you are feeling bold, you can also jump over into the chat and share with us what the protected characteristic is, what the negative effect is, and how you think that protected characteristic was a factor in the negative effect. So basically, you can elaborate on your answers in the chat if you choose to do so. And I will open up that chat so that I can see people's responses. So I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. Okay. So is there a protected characteristic? Most people said yes. And I would agree. I think there's a protected characteristic here of gender. So this person is being asked out on a date, so we can relate to that to gender or sex. Is there a negative effect? Everyone is saying yes, absolutely. The negative effect is they no longer feel comfortable at work and they eventually quit their job because of it. And then lastly, is the protected characteristic a factor in the negative effect? And most of you said yes, absolutely. So they quit their job because of what they were experiencing at work. So this is an example of sexual harassment in the workplace. Okay, let's move on to the next example. So let's meet Sam. Sam's the only female in the sales office. Some of Sam's coworkers think it is funny to call her into their office and show her inappropriate images. Sam reports these issues to her boss, a male. Her boss tells her to loosen up. She applies for a promotion. The hiring committee, though, is made up of a few of those who harass her at work. She's passed over for a coworker with less experience and lower sales. Her boss tells her she might have been promoted if she'd been more chill at work. So again, same 3 questions. And if you want to jump into the chat and elaborate on that, you absolutely can. Okay, so is there a protected characteristic? Everyone said yes, there is. And this would be gender here as well. We can see it, Sam identifies as female. Is there a negative effect? Yes, she was passed over for a promotion. And is the protected characteristic a factor in the negative effect? This one's very obvious. Sometimes it's not quite as obvious. You don't necessarily always have a boss tell you the reason that, like, blatantly that they didn't promote you for something. But in this case, we do have the boss saying, yeah, they could have been promoted if they'd been more chill at work, and essentially accept the harassment that was coming at them and not make a big deal of it. So again, another example of discrimination or sexual harassment in the workplace. Okay, we have one more example. This is Jess. And I realized I chose this name and then I'm like, oh wait, this is no relation to me. I'm simply a name. So Jess shows up for a job interview. At the end of the interview, the interviewer tells her that they'll be sending her an offer. So it sounds like it's a done deal. Then the interviewer makes a lewd comment that her outfit shows off her nice figure and that the other workers in the office will be very happy to have her on board. Jess makes a comment that this comment makes her uncomfortable. The interviewer abruptly ends the interview and never sends her an offer. So again, same 3 questions. What do we think? Okay, so is there a protected characteristic? Most of you said yes. So again, I would say that this relates to gender, which sexual harassment generally relates to, well, it's the gender, sexual identity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. So they can all kind of be wrapped up. So in this case, I would say yes, there is a protected characteristic as well. Is there a negative effect? I would say yes, she didn't get a job after it seems like it was a done deal. And was the protected characteristic a factor in the negative effect? And again, in this case, the interviewer, once Jess made a comment or said that the comment had made her uncomfortable, then it went nowhere else. So I think in this case, you could assume that the comment or Jess's response about the comment, and so her gender being at play, was a factor in that negative effect. So again, another example of sexual harassment in the workplace. So as I said, we're going to use these examples throughout the series to kind of look at different options. And so with that though, we don't want to leave it on a note of just doom and gloom and here's what the law says. But we do want to focus on the reality that there is help available. And so I am going to turn it over now to Quinn Blythe, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the sexual harassment legal specialist at the WRC. And she's going to talk through some resources that are available to those experiencing issues with human rights at work, including sexual harassment.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here today with us. So like Jessica said, my name is Quinn and I'm the sexual harassment legal specialist at the Workers Resource Center, which we'll call the WRC for short. So we're going to get into some resources. Okay, so at the Workers Resource Center, we have a program called Public Legal Education. So we offer free workplace seminars based on all things workers' rights. So we present on employment standards, employment insurance, WCB, and then we also have a casework program. So if you have any questions, if you would like to make a complaint, if you need help applying for AISH or CPP disability, anything like that, you can contact us and we'll work one-on-one with you to address your case and go over what your options are and help you apply for benefits or make complaints if necessary. And it's important to mention that all of our programs are free. There's absolutely no cost for anything that we offer. So that's the public legal education, and there's lots of information on our website as well. And then my role at the Workers Resource Center, I work in the sexual harassment advisory program. So what we do is I offer a 1-hour seminar for sexual harassment in the workplace. So we go over what sexual harassment is, what the different forms of it can be, and then we emphasize prevention and allyship. So what to do if you are in a workplace and you see sexual harassment going on, how to prevent it in the future. And it's a really good seminar. So if you're looking to book that, please reach out to me. And I also do offer the casework. So if you have or are experiencing sexual harassment, you can meet one-on-one with me if you wish, and we can go over different options. We can explore your options. I can give supports and resources, and I can work with you in terms of what your case is. And we can make complaints to different regulating bodies. There's many different things that we can do. So please, if you have experienced sexual harassment or know somebody that has, please encourage them to reach out to me if you would like some support with that. So another great resource is the Sipley website. So I use it all the time. It's really great. So they have a lot of different tip sheets. They have videos. They have everything to do with your rights at work. And like Jessica said earlier, they make it make sense. So a lot of the time when I read legal stuff, I don't know what I'm reading, but on the Sipley website, it's very clear, lots of fact sheets. So if you are looking for information on your rights as an employee, I would encourage you to go to the Sipley website and explore their website, because they have lots of different resources from workplace to family law, different things like that. So that's a great option for you as well. And now we're going to talk about ASUS. So ASUS is the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services. So they have a province-wide provincial platform that you can contact either by phone, by text, and then they have a chat option on their website. And so this is for anybody who has experienced sexual assault or violence or sexual harassment. And it's also for those that are supporting somebody who has experienced sexual violence. So it is open 7 days a week. They provide resources and supports. They'll connect you to different supports in your community. And the line is answered by trained professionals who are trained in how to respond to sexual violence. So this is a really amazing resource that you can contact in like I said, by calling or texting and chat. And it's province-wide. So no matter where you live in Alberta, you can contact it, which is quite unique for a province to have that. It's a really great resource. And if, like I said, if you are supporting somebody, or if you're in the helping profession, this line is also for you to call for supports and resources. So next is the Moments Matter campaign. So this is also brought to us by the ASUS, the Alberta Association for Sexual Assault Services. So we know that workplaces that are positive and respectful, that they discourage sexual harassment. So what the Moments Matter campaign does is it shares stories and moments that are relatable to help Alberta leaders understand and see how easy it is to build safe and respectful workplaces. And it celebrates Alberta leaders and workers who are making their workplace safe and respectful for everybody. So you can see much more information on their website. They have lots of supports and resources and videos, things like that. And it's just working together. We're all working together to make share information and support and resources on how we can make workplaces more safe, respectful for everybody. And so Jessica talked about the Human Rights Commission. So the Alberta Human Rights Commission aims to resolve human rights violations. So we can make complaints to the Human Rights Commission if you have faced discrimination based on one of the protected grounds. So 77% of complaints cited employment practices. So that was discrimination in the employment. And 14% of complaints cited gender. And like we mentioned earlier, sexual harassment falls under gender. So there's lots of information on their website. What I really like is on the website, they have a lot of good case studies that show previous complaints that had been made and what the result was, just so you can get a good idea of how they work. If you would like assistance filing a complaint, we can absolutely help you do that at the WRC. But an important thing to remember is that you have to make a complaint 1 year from the date of incident. So when your discrimination happened, you have to make a complaint within 1 year. So of course, the different legislations and different things can be hard to navigate. So please give us a call and we can work with you to make sure that we get all the right information and everything like that. So check out their website if you want some more information, or give us a call if you would like to make a complaint. We can help you do so. So this is the tip sheet that we have that we've created for this seminar. So you will be getting one, and you can also find it on our website in a couple of weeks, and as well as Sipley. So it is the it's a lot of what we discussed today. And so it's just kind of a good review that you can look at, and we'll get other tip sheets in the future as well, but it just goes over what we talked about today.
Perfect. Thanks, Quinn, for that review of the resources available to everyone. So that concludes kind of the substantive portion of our presentation, but of course, we'd like to turn it over to any questions that you have. We still have about 15 minutes, so we've left time for you to ask any burning questions. So please feel free to throw them into the Q&A chat box there. And yeah, we will answer them as they pop up. As we said, though, as Quinn mentioned as well, so that info sheet and the recording of the webinar will be available on both our website and WRC's website. Give us kind of a few days to get that up there, but they will be made available, and we'll also send an email out to everyone letting you know where to find those resources. But we want to make sure that you have as much information to take away from today's presentation as possible. So if someone you know in your workplace or whatnot wasn't able to attend today, then you can let them know that this webinar will be available for them to watch on demand. And if you're working in an environment where you are supporting those who might be experiencing sexual violence, or discrimination or sexual harassment in the workplace, then as Quinn said, you send them to the WRC if they need some support. But there's also the info sheet available to give them some more information on what discrimination is and what human rights are in the workplace. I'm just going to quickly look. And Natalie's also thrown in the chat. Remember, we have 2 more webinars in this series coming up. So we have termination of employment is on Wednesday, October 20th at 10 a.m. And resolving disputes is on Tuesday, November 16th at 10 a.m. And you have to register for those ones separately. So just like you did for this one, you can head to Eventbrite or sipley.ca/workshops, and you'll find the registration links there. So I don't see any burning questions in here. This is a rarity for us. So we were right poised to answer all those questions. But if there are none, then we will give it another 30 seconds, I'd say, and then we will. Oh, now we've got a question. How is bullying of women classified that is not sexual? It can still be, again, when we're looking at sexual harassment. Oh, actually, I'll turn this over. Quinn or Carolyn, do you guys want to take a crack at that one first?
I think we'll go with you, Jess, and then we can chime in as needed. You're on a start, so you start us off.
Okay. How is bullying of women classified? We're always looking at what that looks like. So bullying doesn't have to be sexual necessarily. Sexual harassment is we're looking at, unwanted sexual behavior in the workplace. But when we talk about discrimination, we can also look at bullying. So again, the legal test for discrimination is there a protected characteristic? So gender still being a characteristic, is there some sort of negative effect? And then is that protected characteristic an effect of a factor in that negative effect? So I hope that answers the question. Carolyn or Quinn, did you want to add anything to that one?
I'll just elaborate a little bit too. So
Yes.
often what happens in these situations too is intersectionality. So discrimination might occur on a multitude of levels. So it might not just be gender, it may be country of origin, it may be gender identity, gender expression. There's a lot of document that shows that power controls and harassment often occur in issues of intersecting discriminatory elements. So just to kind of, it's more of a tack on piece. We can submit a discrimination complaint to the Alberta Human Rights Commission under a number of factors. So we can cross off multiple areas of discrimination on the application. We just have to include the negative effects, as Jess was elaborating on, and the protected characteristics. So just know that if we're kind of not sure how these waters are getting muddied for a multitude of reasons, we can kind of sift through and likely sort of hone in on how that would still be considered discriminatory.
So a legal test should actually say protected. You need at least one protected characteristic, but often it's not as cut and dry as, oh, it's simply related to gender. As Carolyn said, there can be many different characteristics at play. We have a question here. Quinn said that you can only carry forward a complaint if the event happened within a year. Is there no give on this time frame? Carolyn shaking her head no. Quinn,
no, unfortunately not. They're very strict with the 1 year. There are other options, such as potentially a civil route that you could go, but they are very strict. Even if you send it and something happens in the mail and it comes in late, it's not always accepted then too. So they are quite strict on the 1 year.
And just to elaborate too, if there's an incident that has occurred within that 1 year, but say there was 3 incidences before that, and that 1 year expiry is over, we can still include that information, but they don't use it necessarily to evaluate the discrimination from the date of incident. They use that as context to sort of get a more accurate picture of what's happened. So there's, I would say if you're not sure about that timeline and that date might be coming up for you or someone I would encourage them to call Quinn as soon as you can, and we can kind of figure out what that date is that we might actually use in that complaint.
So it's really important, if you know someone or if you have experienced discrimination in the workplace, to really look into it right away and don't wait, because there is help available, but there may be some limits if you wait too long. So definitely reach out.
Hello, disembodied voice here. There is a question in the chat that may be interesting to a lot of people. With the current situation right now, can you consider the vaccination passport a discrimination? We had to go there, didn't we?
We've been talking about this all week in various iterations, but Jess, I think I might defer to you to start that conversation.
I'm trying to think on how I'll say this for this. I'm going to use the word legal limbo right now. There is a lot of legal discussion over whether or not vaccine passports are legal, but it's not a cut and dried yes or no answer. There's so many different factors. It depends on different workplaces. It depends on the policies in place, what the employer's doing. Like if we're looking at it from a workplace perspective, or, if I'm thinking more of like employers mandating vaccines, or even service providers mandating that people be vaccinated to enter. There's so much legal discussion right now about whether or not that is allowed. And there's no clear answer. So I'll say that we're in this state. The one thing I will say is that we do have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is maybe something that people are kind of thinking back to, which sets out a number of freedoms that we do have. But it also sets out, we say Section 1 can sometimes save actions that may be considered, that we may otherwise consider to be infringements on our freedoms. And so Section 1 is kind of a catch-all that allows governments to make decisions that are for the good of everyone. So there's a justifiable reason for something to infringe on our rights. So I'm not saying one way or the other whether or not this is justifiable or what's happening, but I can't give an answer because there are so many different factors at play here. And so this is going to play out over the next several months, how this works. And I can't say more than that also without delving into the realm of legal advice, which I cannot do over this. So I'm going to leave it at that. Carolyn, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, just it would very much be case by case, and they don't have a lot of precedent. So it really isn't an answer. I would say if there's some reason why you were not able to participate in your company's, say, vaccination policy, you would need to provide some documentation. So
we are definitely another one.
Sorry, Jess. We've got two more questions. Yeah.
Okay, so boss tells the female employee that he will make her cry and goes out of his way to do so. He's a sole proprietor and there's no HR department. What are the female's options? So I'm just going to give kind of a statement. I can't give any legal advice in this session. So we're here to provide information only. So there are different options for the person. If they, as Quinn talked about, they can reach out to the WRC if they're looking for support to see if if the situation might warrant a complaint. But I'm not able to give any more information specific to the situation other than you can reach out to different to the WRC to see what your options might be.
Yeah, like some questions we might ask is well, what was the context and what he said to make her cry? How was it framed? Like there would be a lot of questions. We wouldn't assume that maybe outright would be discrimination. It may be harassment and bullying under occupational health and safety at this point, but we would have to evaluate what the negative effect was on that characteristic to really determine that. So it's sort of, I know it's hard because you want these answers, but sometimes there's so many other questions that kind of bleed into it. So that's why we have an intake coordinator who really will help kind of ask those questions in a gentle manner to sort of ascertain where we're going with that complaint.
Perfect. Okay, another question we have here is, what does inclusion look like in the workplace, and is ignoring an employee considered discrimination? Carolyn, do you want to take that one on
Sure.
first?
And if you want to add anything, let me know at the end. So Inclusion is a bit of a vague term here. Like, I'm not entirely sure. Like, I know there's a lot of employers that are implementing statements of diversity and equity in the workplace. And that is more of a commitment of an employer to not engage in discriminatory practices. So the question is, what does inclusion look like in the workplace? Well, it could look like many things, and you know, there could be a policy on paper. It depends what they do in practice. So that's kind of you would need more information on what the inclusion piece was, that the definition that the employer's using. In terms of ignoring an employee considered discrimination, maybe. So again, none of these really have thoroughly cut and dry answers. You know, some questions might be, why would an employer be ignoring this person? What elements or what protected ground? So that's a question we ask a lot on what protected ground do you feel the discrimination is occurring? So sometimes, unfortunately, there's sort of a bit of a gray area between an employer not being very nice to somebody, but does that actually meet a threshold for a human rights complaint? And it really is dependent on the context, the information that's been given and what's been said. So one general piece of advice we would have for anyone who is experiencing what they see as discrimination or knows somebody, the best thing to start doing is really documenting things. So when we submit human rights complaints, we submit them typically in chronological order from sort of the start and where that went. So the more documentation you have to substantiate that discrimination, the better. There's a lot of times where people say, well, I feel they're doing it because of this, but that doesn't always equate to documentation or evidence that we can give to submit. So it would really, I would just say, if things are going south in your employment, like you're feeling uneasy or you feel like something's not quite right, I would strongly encourage you to start documenting what you're experiencing so that we can get a really accurate picture. So Quinn, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but that would sort of be my general feedback on that.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think we will wrap it up there. But I do want to give a huge thank you to Quinn and Carolyn for joining us this morning. And they will it'll be the three of us back here again on October 20th, I think it is, for the next one. So make sure you go ahead and register for that one. And as I said, we'll be talking about termination of employment, which is a big topic always. And so, yeah, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Hi, everyone.